The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire, a cruel display of power. What the Imperial Senate of the Galactic Dominion intended to be a quiet act of authority turned into something else entirely. A silent execution meant more as a warning than a show. 10 human women, chosen at random from various sectors under Dominion control, were hanged at dawn in the central square of Gizmo Prime. The official report labeled them enemy combatants, though no evidence was ever presented. There was no trial, and their names were never recorded. To the Dominion, they were nothing, a forgotten detail, an exercise in bureaucratic efficiency. But the universe had made a grave, irreversible mistake. Nobody could have predicted what came next. Within hours, the execution footage, intended as a subtle demonstration of Dominion authority, was intercepted and circulated through human communication networks. The message was clear: humanity was under Imperial rule, and this was the price of resistance. What the Dominion failed to understand was the intricate web of human society, the seemingly innocuous connections that bind people together into an unpredictable, volatile force. Among the executed had been a mother, the emotional anchor of a grieving scientist who had spent his life designing weapons that never saw the light of day. They had killed the sister of the man who ran the largest black market for arms in human history. One of the women had been the ex-wife of a military strategist whose thirst for vengeance was sharp enough to cut titanium. Another had been a beloved barkeep at a remote garrison, someone who'd poured drinks and heard the off-duty stories of soldiers now burning with fury. In hanging those women, the Dominion had effectively placed a noose around its own neck. Earth's response did not come as an official statement. There was no pomp, no ceremony, no long debates in cold conference halls. Humanity didn't operate the way the Dominion did, weighed down by inefficiency and endless deliberation. Instead, a whisper began in the shadows among the most dangerous men and women on Earth. A cargo freighter in deep space, the freighter Midnight Tempest, vanished from an Imperial checkpoint near the Denys 9 asteroid field. 2 days later, the communications relay on the Imperial frontier was hit by an unexplained cyber attack that crippled the Dominion's ability to monitor human activity. On the third day, the first ship burned. The Dominion supply vessel Belrose was on routine patrol when it picked up an unknown energy signature off its starboard. It had been a simple, boring mission, until a human distress call cut through its comms. By the time they answered, their security had already been breached. There were no alarms, no firefights, just silence, then darkness. The Empire's initial response was slow, dismissing the incident as a minor skirmish. Then came another strike, and another. Within a week, 8 ships had been taken. Their crews turned up missing, or bound and gagged inside their own escape pods, humiliated but alive. It was psychological warfare at its finest, a demonstration that humanity could dismantle the Dominion piece by piece without shedding unnecessary blood. Publicly, the Galactic Dominion downplayed the attacks as petty acts of piracy. Behind closed doors, however, the High Council grew uneasy. The problem with humans wasn't their technology, which by Dominion standards remained primitive. It wasn't their numbers, laughably small compared to the Empire's vast reach. The problem was their unpredictability. No one understood that better than Admiral Marcus Hale, the Dominion's supreme commander, an imposing figure of the Zarek species, his dark, polished skin like molten obsidian and 4 eyes tracking the reports arrayed before him. Unlike many of his colleagues, he recognized a pattern in the strikes. The apparent randomness was an illusion. The humans were testing the Dominion, probing strategically and pushing the limits without overreaching. This was not a disorganized rebellion. It was warfare. "Bring me the names of those we executed," he ordered. His subordinates exchanged puzzled looks. "Sir, they were—" "Find them," he interrupted. There was a pause, then a flurry of activity as officers dispersed. Admiral Hale exhaled slowly and stared at the tactical map floating in front of him. He was beginning to accept what many in the Dominion refused to admit: the humans did not fear them. On Earth, the storm had already broken. A war council had convened in a retrofitted underground bunker that once housed a nuclear facility. Around the table sat no politicians, no oath-bound diplomats or etiquette-bound officials, but the true leaders of humanity: warlords, corporate magnates, rogue scientists, and crime bosses united by a single cause. At the head of the table sat General Jonah Mercer, a man whose presence demanded attention. Scarred by countless battles, his steely gray eyes watched every report without flinching. The latest update was grim. The Dominion was reinforcing borders, increasing patrols, and bolstering their military presence in human-occupied space. They were preparing to escalate. "We have an advantage," Mercer said, setting his tablet aside and drawing a long breath. "They don't know how we fight." Across the table, an elderly scientist adjusted his glasses. "They outnumber us 100-1, he said. Mercer's smile was cold and thin. "They are an empire," he said. "We are their problem." Soon the Dominion would learn what it meant to have humanity as a problem. The first planetary assault arrived without warning. A colony on the fringe of charted space, lightly defended and deemed strategically irrelevant by Imperial planners, was taken in the dead of night. A human strike team disabled planetary defenses with surgical precision. In hours, the colony was under human control. They didn't slaughter civilians or raise infrastructure. Instead, they broadcast a message: surrender and you will be spared, resist and we will dismantle you, piece by piece. It wasn't brutality that made humans terrifying, it was their efficiency. For the first time in its long history, the Galactic Dominion felt fear. The High Council called an emergency assembly and fell into endless debate. Some insisted the humans were primitive, a nuisance that would be crushed as others had been. Others saw the truth. The humans weren't merely rebelling, they were counterattacking, and they were not alone. The fault lines in the Empire's foundations had long preceded the executions. Other species, long resentful of Dominion hegemony, watched humanity's resistance with interest. Where they had once seen weak, controllable humans, they now saw opportunity. Mercenaries were the first to defect. The Bari, warriors without causes who suddenly admired human audacity. Entire fleets deserted, their officers losing faith in the Dominion's rule. The Dominion was no longer facing a single human problem. It was confronting a revolution. Reports flooded in from multiple sectors, all telling the same story. Human forces striking where they were least expected, tearing down Imperial outposts with surgical precision. Losses weren't catastrophic, not yet, but they were steady. The humans didn't fight like any rebellion the Dominion had known. They fought like an infestation, erratic, relentless, and uncontrollable. For centuries, the Dominion had governed by brute force, subsuming lesser species with the inevitability of a black hole. Humans were proving to be something else entirely, neither predictable nor entirely logical. Admiral Hale couldn't make sense of their tactics, an odd mix of savagery and restraint, and a knack for turning any battlefield into terrain that favored them. His mandibles clicked in irritation as another transmission came through, a hologram of a high-ranking noble in the Dominion Senate. The envoy's blue projection flickered to life. Ambassador Vel, one of the Emperor's trusted delegates, his elongated face crested with silver, wearing his frustration plainly. "This is becoming unacceptable, Hale," Vel said. "You assured the Senate these primitives would be crushed quickly." "They don't fight like primitives," Admiral Hale replied calmly. "They shouldn't even be fighting." The ambassador's image stuttered. "Should I remind you, Commander, that our forces outmatch them? We have a fleet that could crystallize their planet in a day if we chose." "Then why haven't we?" Hale paused, his face unreadable. He let out a long breath. "The Emperor does not want them made martyrs." The executions had been meant as a warning, not an invitation to war. "We underestimated the depth of their fury," admitted Admiral Hale. "They're not just resisting, they're striking back." The ambassador's holographic form flickered. "Then end this retaliation, Commander. This is not a war the Dominion can afford to prolong. Finish it." The transmission cut off, leaving Admiral Hale in the cold silence of his command deck. His officers shifted uneasily, awaiting his decision. Slowly, he turned, weighing the room and considering his next move. He would lay a trap. Deep within the void of the Ishak expanse, a fleet of human ships advanced with quiet purpose. Unlike the Dominion's gleaming monolithic battleships, this fleet was a patchwork of repurposed freighters, outdated cruisers, and heavily modified civilian transports. The largest of them, the Indomitable, served as a temporary flagship. On board, General Jonah Mercer stood with arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on the glowing holographic battle map before him. Across the table, Colonel Juno Reyes adjusted her combat vest, her dark curls pulled back in a tight knot, her expression unreadable. "They're preparing a trap," she said, breaking the silence. Mercer smirked. "Of course they are." Reyes narrowed her eyes. "Then why are we walking straight into it?" "Because," Mercer said, "we set traps better than they do." The corner of her mouth twitched, but she held her tongue. It was a calculated risk, and they both knew it. The Dominion had finally begun to take humanity seriously, deploying a fleet large enough to crush any standard insurgency. To send so many warships to a single sector meant they were confident of victory, which was their second mistake. Humanity didn't fight wars with numbers. They fought with cunning, desperation, and a pathological refusal to surrender. A low chime sounded at the command terminal. The Dominion fleet had arrived. A lesser commander might have panicked. The Imperial forces outnumbered them 5-1, gleaming warships brimming with the arrogance of a species that had never known true desperation. Mercer simply tightened his gloves and addressed his crew. "Give the order," he said. "Initiate Phase 1. On the bridge of the Dominion flagship, the Sovereign Fury, Admiral Hale watched the human vessels with cold caution. His fleet had been rearmed since the last defeat, prepared to crush the irregular human flotilla now floating before them, as though uncertain of their next move. He felt the tension ripple through his own officers. No one wanted to admit that these improvised ships had already caused the Empire great harm. Still, Hale believed humanity's luck was about to end. "Advance," he commanded. "Target weapons." The Dominion fleet surged forward, warships slicing through the void with predatory grace. Energy shields flared to life, ion cannons powered up, targeting computers locked on. Then, without warning, every Dominion vessel went dark. The bridge of the Sovereign Fury plunged into shadows, consoles flickering and emergency lights casting jagged silhouettes across the walls. Hale's mandibles clacked in fury as he spun toward his crew. "What happened?" An officer hammered desperately at a dead console. "Sir, our systems have been hijacked. Internal overrides aren't responding." A new voice crackled through every ship in the fleet, human, casual, brimming with confidence. "Hello there," it said. "Welcome to the first intergalactic cyber war. You lose." Hale's mandibles locked tight. "Who are you?" "Oh, nobody special," the voice replied, amused. "Just a guy who spent way too much time hacking your banks for fun. Turns out your military software isn't much better." A laugh rippled across the comms. A human laugh. The reality struck Hale like a hammer. The humans had disabled his fleet without firing a shot. "Our systems are rebooting," an officer cried. "Too late," Hale growled. Explosions rocked Dominion vessels as human infiltration teams already aboard sabotaged critical systems. The mighty Imperial fleet, so certain of its supremacy, never imagined the battle would begin before their weapons even came online. On the Indomitable, Mercer surveyed the chaos unfolding across the battlefield. Dominion ships staggered helplessly, stripped of power, already compromised before the first exchange of fire. Colonel Reyes whistled under her breath. "I can't believe it worked." Mercer's half-smile was cold. "You still underestimate our people." She shook her head. "No, I just forget how fun it is to fight dirty." By the time Dominion crews regained control of their systems, it was over. Their warships had been gutted from within, captured, or left drifting powerless. The few that managed to escape carried stories of terror, an enemy who could cripple entire fleets with keystrokes, infiltrate ships undetected, and dismantle empires not with brute force, but with ingenuity. Admiral Hale reviewed the damage reports in silence, body rigid with the cold certainty of what had just occurred. The Empire had made its gravest mistake, underestimating humanity. And now, there was no stopping them. The Galactic Dominion had suffered defeats before, but always recovered. War was a language they had spoken fluently for centuries. If attacked, they responded with overwhelming force. If rebellion rose, they crushed it under fire. Empires did not fall to mere skirmishes. They endured. But this was different. The war was no longer fought on battlefields. It had moved into the shadows of the Dominion's own infrastructure. It began quietly, a minor fluctuation in the galactic banking system, a 1% deviation in interstellar trade routes, a negligible delay in hyperspace shipping manifests. Nothing alarming on its own, nothing to trigger immediate scrutiny. But the anomalies multiplied. In a distant trade hub, an automated system detected irregularities in currency conversion between Dominion credits and independent sector coinage. The variance was so small it went unnoticed by senior officials. Yet within weeks, the prices of vital goods, fuel, food, medical supplies, began climbing inexplicably. At first, the Dominion dismissed the tremors as natural market instability. Then entire sectors failed to process routine transactions. Cargo manifests scrambled, supply chains collapsed in real time. And still, humanity hadn't fired a single shot. Admiral Hale stood rigid before holographic projections of financial data, his 4 crimson eyes fixed on the endless cascade of fluctuating figures. His fleet had recovered from its earlier defeat, reinforced with fresh warships, restructured for efficiency. They were ready for war. Yet before they could launch a counteroffensive, something far more insidious began suffocating the empire from within. "They're collapsing our economy," said the finance minister, his voice taut, mandibles quivering with restrained panic. Hale did not reply immediately. He had spent his life on battlefields, commanding legions, subjugating weaker species under imperial will. He had prepared for every kind of military confrontation. But this was not war as he understood it. This was a deliberate, methodical strangulation. "They're sabotaging our supply chains," added another minister. "Every time we fix one disruption, another appears. They're using our own systems against us." Finally, Hale turned, his voice sharp. "Explain." The head of the Dominion's economic office, an elderly official named Vox, stepped forward. The arrogance he once carried had been replaced by something perilously close to fear. "Humans have exploited weaknesses in our trade networks. They've infiltrated financial systems, manipulated shipping routes, and somehow sabotaged the algorithms of our central bank." "Impossible," Hale growled. "If it were impossible," Vox snapped, "we wouldn't be having this conversation, Supreme Commander." A heavy silence gripped the war chamber. Hale had long believed humans to be reckless, undisciplined, lacking in strategy. But this was no chaotic uprising. It was systematic, intentional, and it was working. On Earth, deep within the old nuclear facility, a group of human strategists and economists studied the latest results of their campaign. The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of old fans filling the silence between voices. At the center stood General Tom Miller, arms crossed, listening intently to the reports. Across from him, Lucas Vance, once a financial hacker, now an economic saboteur, grinned as he pointed at a massive screen showing the Dominion's collapsing markets. "They're bleeding," Vance announced. "Their credit value dropped another 6% this cycle. Trade deals are unraveling, and their military budget is eating itself alive." Colonel Juno Reyes leaned against the table, skeptical. "I still don't understand how you pulled this off," Vance smirked. "Ever heard of an old Earth scam called short selling?" Miller gave a dry snort. "Explain." "All right, imagine someone loans you something valuable, say a starship. It's not yours, just borrowed. Before giving it back, you bet its value will fall, so you sell it at today's high price. Then you wait until the value crashes, buy it back cheap, return it, and keep the profit." Reyes frowned. "And you applied that to an entire galactic economy?" Vance's grin widened. "Exactly." The room went still. Then Miller let out a low, dark laugh. "You turned a financial scam into a weapon." "Not just a scam," Vance countered. "A perfectly executed maneuver, mathematically flawless economic devastation. First, we disrupted supply chains with tiny anomalies. Nothing obvious. Then we undermined market confidence, leaked false reports, sabotaged comms, and forged economic forecasts. The Dominion's merchants panicked. They dumped assets, desperate to save themselves. And then he mimed an explosion with his hands. Boom. Reyes shook her head. "You're telling me we didn't even need warships?" "Warships are fun," Vance said with a shrug. "But this," he tapped the screen, "this is real destruction." Miller studied the holo map. The Dominion had built its empire on the belief that military might alone guaranteed stability. They had never imagined an enemy capable of breaking them without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Because humanity wasn't just fighting the Dominion's armies, they were dismantling its very ability to exist. In the High Council chamber of the Dominion, chaos reigned. Ambassador Veith stood at the center, his composure shattered. Imperial officials screamed at each other, panic consuming them. The economic collapse was no longer theory, it was happening. Trade routes dissolved, entire economies fell overnight. The imperial currency hit historic lows. "This is a coordinated attack," a senator bellowed. Veith clenched his jaw. "No fleet could have achieved this," he admitted. "This is something else." The emperor himself had not yet spoken, but his silence weighed heavier than the shouting. Seated upon his throne, fingers steepled, reptilian eyes cold and calculating, he had ruled for centuries, weathered countless rebellions. But this was the slow death of an empire. Finally, he spoke. "We must end this war before we lose everything." His words fell like a death sentence. To even suggest surrender was unthinkable, yet undeniable. The humans had fought the war on their own terms and turned the Dominion's greatest strengths into its downfall. That night, in the imperial palace of Engizol Prime, silence replaced centuries of supremacy. Once proud banners hung dull and lifeless. On his throne sat Emperor Zeldar, his scaled fingers drumming against carved stone. He had crushed civilizations, his name whispered in reverence across hundreds of worlds. But now, for the first time, he felt fear. Not fear of armies or rebellion, but of the realization that 1,000 years of rule meant nothing when the structure beneath had been hollowed out. Kneeling before him stood Supreme Commander Ralph Vader, obsidian armor glinting in the dim light. A warrior unaccustomed to failure, yet now carrying its weight. "The humans have given us an ultimatum," Ralph Vader said, voice steady despite the humiliation. Zeldar's eyes narrowed. "And if we refuse?" Vader hesitated, not from doubt but from the sheer weight of the words. "Then before the next sunrise, the Dominion will cease to exist." The Emperor's claws dug into his throne. "How?" "They control our fleets. Our economy is collapsing. Our people riot in the streets, demanding peace. If we continue, there will be nothing left to rule." For ages, Zeldar had seen humans as weak, predictable, a species from a single insignificant world, never a true threat to a galactic empire. Yet here they stood, not by conquering with force, but by unraveling the Dominion from within, like a parasite eating its host alive. And now, at the very end, Zeldar understood. The humans didn't seek conquest or vengeance. They sought only victory. And they had achieved it. A faint chime signaled an incoming transmission. Ralph Vader accepted it without waiting. The hologram flickered to life. General Tom Miller, calm, battle-worn, sipping a half-full cup of coffee. The contrast was brutal. On one side, an empire collapsing. On the other, a man who looked as though he had already written its obituary. "Well," Miller said, taking a sip, "this is a little awkward." Zeldar flared his nostrils in fury. "You dare address me like this?" Miller set the cup down, leaning forward. "Let's not pretend you still hold the advantage, Your Highness. We both know how this ends." "You demand our surrender?" Zeldar growled. Miller tilted his head, feigning thought. "I wouldn't call it surrender, more like a restructuring of power." "And if I refuse?" Zeldar pressed. Miller's smile held no joy, only inevitability. "Then we finish what we started. You see, the thing about humans, we don't give up. You can wipe out a battalion, a city, even a planet, and we'll still come back, because we don't fight wars the way you do. We don't need to outnumber you. We only need to outsmart you. And I think we've proven how that goes." The Emperor's claws trembled on his throne. Miller's voice grew casual, almost conversational. "Right now, my people control most of your economy. Your empire is surviving on fumes. We have access to your military data, your fleet movements, your defense networks. We've left you just enough to believe you have choices. But the truth, Your Highness, is this. If you don't accept our terms, by this time tomorrow, you won't even have a throne left to sit on." Vader had seen countless wars, studied battles, crushed rebellions, but he had never witnessed anything like this. Miller took another sip. "So, what's it going to be?" The silence stretched painfully. Finally, the Emperor exhaled. With a voice stripped of pride, Vader asked, "What are your terms?" Miller leaned forward. 1. You publicly admit the Dominion's crimes against humanity. 2. You pay reparations, economic, technological, at our price. 3. Miller's faint smile sharpened. You never interfere with us again. Zeldar's jaw clenched, but he knew there was no other choice. The humans had already won. "I accept." Miller's smile widened slightly. "Good choice." The transmission ended. Vader turned to his Emperor, waiting for orders, but Zeldar sat hollow, the weight of centuries gone in an instant. No longer ruler of a galactic empire, just a man who had been defeated. And now? Vader asked cautiously. Zeldar let out a long, bitter sigh. Now, he said, we survive. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The Dominion had fallen, not to war or overwhelming firepower, but to the relentless, chaotic brilliance of humanity. The story of the 10 women executed, the spark that lit the fire, became legend. And as humanity claimed its place among the stars, one lesson remained clear. They were not conquerors. They were not tyrants. But they were a species that would never, ever be underestimated again.